Welcome back. Today we will be ranking every single accessible red tome in the game, which happens to be a lot because a lot of them happen to be grails, so the list is somewhat bloated in that regard, simply because there aren't as many in the normal pool, but that's okay. There's still quite a bit to go over nonetheless. For those new here, I rank each unit based on two factors, their performance rating and their cost rating. The performance rating is complete subjectivity based on how I believe they hold up in the current meta, while the cost rating is how easy it is to invest into said unit on a minimalistic level. So let's say, for example, I wanted to invest into a Tanya, but she needed a kit overhaul. Basically, her cost rating would be a bit lower on that end, while someone that may not necessarily need as many skills will have a higher cost rating. Basically, the higher the cost rating, the easier it is to invest into them. But of course, it won't really matter all too much for long-time running players, simply because they may have the resources to invest into pretty much any unit, especially on a budget level. And yeah, that's pretty much the rundown of it. We may as well just get started with the first red tome, Alfric. Alfric is one of the newer Grand Hero Battle red tomes that we got in the game. He came out late last year alongside the Yuri banner with all the Ashen Wolves. And his stat line isn't the worst by any means. He has really high attack at 40 base, he has workable speed at 31, and then really good res at 37. Everything else isn't nearly as notable. Plus, his inheritable weapon isn't exactly the greatest either. It simply grants plus 5 attack and res during combat and heals 7 HP after combat for one combat, which can be a problem if he ends up going in multiple combats. As such, I decided to replace his weapon entirely for his budget build, because I feel like something like Serpent Tome is going to be way more consistent in terms of performance, simply because you can make him into an enemy phase unit, and he'll be able to take on multiple units at a time. So for his budget build, I gave him triple distant defense with quick riposte and rouse attack res. With Iceberg, should he be doubled, he will be able to trigger Iceberg on every second hit and be able to take out a lot of foes in the enemy phase. While his premium build leans more on the speed side, but also takes into account the enemy phase utility by giving him Unity Blooms, as well as Unity and Attack Risk Form. Basically, we're stacking up his two best stats while simultaneously making him somewhat speedy so he can avoid doubles. And then No See Disrupt is there so he can take on any sort of fire sweep effects that may be present. Overall though, I would say that Alfric and a lot of similar tomes without any sort of PRF are going to be performing on a similar level, simply because there aren't that many inheritables for most units to take advantage of, unlike Lances or Axes, for example. So I'm only willing to give him a 5.5 out of 10. Next we have Arette, who's basically a cavalry Alfric. She has the same inheritable weapon as he does. Their stat line is relatively similar, except her speed is a bit on the lower end, but you can still speed stack, which I'll show you how you can do in a second. But for the most part, they're pretty much the same. It's just class differences. If you want to use her on budget, I also recommend doing the triple distant defense set with quick riposte, but we're going to keep her innate res blows, so her damage output is a lot better. But for her premium set, I figured we may as well do something different and make her a bit more speedy. Her speed isn't exactly the best, but it's more than workable. With stuff like Attack Speed Catch 4 and Attack Speed Menace and Trace, that already gives her a massive stat swing to her attack and speed, on top of Luminous Grace granting plus 5 attack and speed, and then Blade Session granting up to 9 attack and speed. It's quite a lot to work with. That being said, I do find that her performance overall is definitely lacking in comparison to Alfric, simply because of her class type, which is a problem in my opinion, simply because the fact that she has limited BSC, which is fine on its own depending on how it's allocated. However, in her case, she's built to be an enemy phase cavalry unit, which means she is lacking a lot more skills comparatively. She doesn't have access to No See Disrupt, she has class weaknesses, she has less BST, which means she's more than likely to get one shot in comparison, because Alfric does have a lot more HP to work with. So I do find that the comparisons between Alfric and Arette are pretty big, which is why I'm going to give her 1 point less than Alfric. Next we have Arvis, who comes with a Broadleaf Tome that inflicts minus 5 attack and res on all foes within 3 columns or 3 rows centered on the unit. His offensive stat line isn't the worst by any means, especially with flowers. He has 34 base attack, which is pretty good, 31 speed, which is workable, and 33 res, which isn't bad by any means, but his 33 HP and 17 defense means he's going to be rather prone to one-shots. If you simply want to use him on budget, you could give him Death Blow with Defense Ploy and Speed Ploy. The idea here is that you just make him into a one-shot nuke, which is entirely possible because you are getting a massive stat swing with all the debuffs you're inflicting on the foe. While on Premium, you could easily give him something like Fury 4 with Sabotage Speed, Time Spells, and Blade Session, so that way he's not only inflicting triple the amount of debuffs on every foe, provided that he meets both conditions, but he's able to trigger Glimmer on every second hit, and Blade Session helps with his overall damage output. I find that Arvis is definitely one of the better investments you could go into when it comes to red mages, simply because his tome, while not necessarily like crazy, is able to hit multiple foes, meaning that he can still target save units that backline, which in my opinion is better than something like Menace, which is why I'm going to give him a 6.5 out of 10. Next we have Aversa, who got a refine. Her base effect is basically Sudden Panic that inflicts -4 to everything to all foes if her HP is higher than the foe's HP by 3 or more. She also inflicts -4 to everything during combat if her HP is above 25%, and then her special refine is just plug-in, which isn't the worst for combat purposes, but I'll talk about why I have a problem with it in a second. Her offensive stat line isn't the worst by any means. She has 33 attack and 34 speed, which isn't bad at all. She also has 42 HP, which can easily be bolstered because of skills like HP plus 5 and R-Dual Flying and stuff like that. But her bulk is definitely not the best. She'll definitely be relying on her HP more than anything else. Honestly, for her budget build, all you really need to do is give her HP skills. She doesn't really need to do anything else beyond that because her whole shtick is her supportive niche, in my opinion. So if you're just stacking HP skills, then chances are you're going to be able to inflict the Sudden Panic on most foes with no issue whatsoever. And their premium build is just making her a lot more offensive. She has R-Dual Flying with Trace and Speed Res Hold, so that way she can be a bit more supportive and offensive at the same time. And an HP Speed plus 2, so you're still getting a good amount of HP, so her weapon can work. That being said, I don't really like the supportive and combative hybrid nature of her weapon simply because it's competing with 2 roles. If she were to stick with her supportive niche, then her improvement isn't really going to be that noticeable because her base effect was only -3, the upgrade is -4. But if you were to prioritize her combat, then the more than likely she may end up missing a lot of her sudden panics, especially against higher merged units. Which is why I'm not really confident in giving her a higher rating than a 6, simply because I don't feel like she excels in one thing or the other, and if you were to prioritize one over the other, then it's not really going to help her out in the long term, especially since her weapon relies on having both roles active. Next we have Kanas, who went from one of the worst red tomes in the game to probably one of the better ones that we have available, simply because his weapon is really good. Kanas' stat line isn't exactly anything to write home about, but his weapon definitely carries him the entire way. If he's within 3 spaces of an ally, which is pretty flexible, he gets 20% of the greater of units res or foes res, and gets an additional attack res plus 5 to unit during combat, which means he's going to be hitting like a truck. And then for a special refund, he gets cooldown on every single turn for the first 3 turns, and he gets an additional plus 5 attack and res during combat, which basically means he's getting 10 attack, 10 res, and then a bunch of true damage from his weapon, meaning that he's going to be hitting really hard. If you want to use something on budget, it's going to be a bit more difficult because I feel like his best performance is definitely going to come from more higher premium skills. You could stick with HP Res 2 and give him Res Ploy with Link, so that way he can still hit pretty hard, but the A slot could easily be replaced simply because it's not really the most amazing skill we have. It's just something he comes with. While his premium set is definitely leveraging on the more speedy side with Blade Session and low speed res, he doesn't have to worry about debuffing the foe's res because chances are his res is going to be higher, which means the weapon is going to prioritize his res over the foe's. I also gave him a 2 cooldown special with Time Spell, so that way for the first 3 turns he can always have a special active and ready to go, meaning he'll hit even harder. It's also worth mentioning that you could also run a double Fury set with AoEs, because his weapon does work with AoEs. He does get the extra damage there. It's kind of comparable to Hatari Karla's in that regard. I figured it'd just be worth mentioning. Overall, I would say Kanas is probably one of the best accessible red tomes that we have in the game, simply because his damage output is disgustingly high. His weapon granting special cooldown for the first 3 turns, on top of having infantry skills, means that his damage output is going to be even higher comparatively. He could also run stuff like no follow-up and all sorts of other things if you want him to double more often, special spiral with AoEs, etc, etc. Simply put, he's just a really solid unit. Next we have Urk, who's probably one of the more generic red tomes that we got in recent history. He comes with Fox Tome that just basically inflicts -4 to everything on foe during combat if he initiates combat, His stat line isn't bad by any means. He has really solid defenses of 35-39 attack speed. His HP is definitely on the higher side, which is a bit concerning because his stat allocation for his defense and res aren't necessarily the best. If you want to use him on budget, you can simply stack solo skills because he does come with speed res solo, give him desperation with rouse attack res, so he can at least patch up his lower res stat. And then if you want to use something on premium, you can actually give him a vulture set, keep the solos, give him menace with no follow-up, and he should be able to output a significant amount of damage, provided that the foes he goes up against are debuffed or don't have any sort of penalty neutralization. That being said, he's still rather generic. Most of the red tomes can run this set, so it's not something unique to him in any regard. Having the higher speed is definitely going to be better for someone like him, simply because the vulture tome is going to make up for a lot of the attack and res deficit that other units may not be able to get. Next we have Garnet, who got probably one of the more polarizing refines in recent history. He gets attack speed plus 10 from his weapon, he gets sweep against non-magic foes, and he gets damage reduction from non-magic foes, which is kind of counterproductive when you think about it, because most of the time, if he's going to be using sweep against the foe, then the damage reduction really isn't going to come into play unless the foe has no counter disrupt. Honestly, I feel that if they switched the effect where if he got damage reduction against magic foes, then he'd probably be in a better spot, simply because his bulk is not good whatsoever. His weapon does not make up for it at all, because it only grants attack speed plus 10, his HP is low, his res is low. Chances are he's not going to kill in one hit anyway, simply because 30 base attack is not really the highest, and then the attack that he gets from his weapon isn't exactly going to be making up for too much, especially against more res heavy foes. If you want to use him on budget, you could give him Ideal with Chill, Res, and Oath, so that way you could continually speed stack him and attack stack him, so that way he's able to double more naturally. And for the premium build, I found that you may as well just give him some sort of supportive niche, because his weapon does inflict flash on turn 3. So you could give him something like Ardul Infantry with Sudden Panic and Infantry Pulse, so that way he's definitely supportive on the infantry side. And then the flash can come in handy on every so often with those turn 3s, simply because the foe not being able to counterattack is a pretty big boon. That being said, I don't find that Garnet overall has a really solid supportive or combative niche. The attack speed plus 10 is nice, but the sweep with the damage reduction is really counterproductive, on top of the fact that it doesn't make up for any of the bulk he would necessarily gain against magic foes. So I find that 5 out of 10 is probably going to be the best place for him. Next we have Henry, who probably has one of the worst stat lines in the game. I have never seen a stat line this bad. 23 attack, 22 speed, 25 res. The defense is pretty okay with 32, and then 45 HP. It definitely screams Gen 1 to me. His refine isn't necessarily the worst, but it doesn't exactly fix up a lot of his issues at all. It has Raven Tone built into it, and if the foe's attack is greater than Henry's attack by 3 points or more, he inflicts -6 attack and res on the foe and guard, which is fine if you want to take him into a more tanky natured set. If you want to build him on budget, I highly recommend just making him a bow and dagger check unit with Bowbreaker, or you could change that to Dagger Breaker depending on preference. Attack Smoke is there simply because you don't want him taking too much damage, and even with the boon and the Attack Smoke debuff, he's not really gonna miss his check whatsoever, because it's Henry. It's gonna be really difficult. And for his premium set, I figured you may as well just make him into the most obnoxious unit in the game by giving him Close Reversal, Lull, and Attack Smoke 4 with Quick Riposte. So basically you're making him absurdly tanky and preventing any sort of counterattack with Attack Smoke 4. Even with that in mind, I still find that Henry is probably going to be one of the worst performing red tones in the game, even with Attack Smoke 4 present. I don't find his overall combat prowess is that good. I can't really imagine finding anyone who disagrees with that. Next we have Hilda, who is pretty interesting as a unit. She has a Dominance Tome that inflicts -6 attack and res on nearest foes within 4 spaces, and she gets attack res plus 6 during combat. Her stat line is also pretty decent, with 40 attack, which is really high, and 40 res, which is also pretty good. Her speed and defense stat are definitely on the lower side though, but that's pretty much the min-max nature of a lot of these slow red tomes. If you want to use her on budget, you can basically keep her base kit with dull range and death blow, so basically you're trying to make her into a one-shot nuke, similar to Arvis. And if you want to use her on a more premium set, you can give her Mirror Stance 3 with low attack res and Joint Drive attack with Quick Riposte, so basically you're making her into an enemy phased unit. I find that Fiery Balganin is going to be a bit difficult to use in general, simply because it is a menace, and it can work on something like Aether Raid's defense, but with how save heavy the meta is at the moment, I find that relying on the dominance effect isn't exactly the best, especially when we have stuff like Slick Fighter to boot. So even if you were to debuff them, there's always that caveat of Slick Fighter being present. But even so, I find that like at worst she's basically just another Lilina, and at best she's outputting a significant amount of damage. Next we have Iago, who's probably one of the cooler red tomes that we have in the game, simply because you have to play by his rules. On odd turns, he inflicts guard and -4 attack and speed if the foe is not adjacent to another foe, and on even turns he inflicts panic and defense res -4 on foes that are adjacent. So basically you have to constantly be playing it with his rules, which is really interesting and can be really annoying to deal with at times. His styling isn't really anything to write home about. He has 38 attack, which is pretty good, 32 res, which can be good for support, and 42 HP, which is going to be his best stat simply because that's what his weapon relies on. Similar to Aversa, if you want to use it on base, you may as well just give him HP skills and call it a day. You don't really need anything else. While on premium, you may as well give him our dual infantry 4 with sabotage speed and infantry pulse. Basically make him a lot more supportive, especially on infantry teams. He does have the res stat to use sabotages, so it's not the worst by any means. I chose sabotage speed mainly because it won't overlap with Iago's tome, and it could allow him to potentially double. That being said, he could definitely use a refine. I feel that his niche is still rather good as a supportive unit, which is why I'm going to give him a 6 out of 10, but the inconsistency with his weapon, while definitely interesting, could always backfire depending on how the foe plays, but there's not always going to be the option of being able to play the way you want to. You may have to play in a certain way so a lot of your allies are able to survive, which can give Iago his niche. Next we have Julius, who probably got one of the better refines from the Grail pool in recent history. He has sabotage attack res, he has dragon wall, he inflicts -6 attack and res on the foe, and an additional -5 attack and res on the foe during combat, which definitely helps with his really low physical bulk and bolsters his overall res by a significant amount. His attack stat's also really good, and his speed stat is more than workable, especially with the amount of skills we have in the game. So you can speed stack him if you want. On budget, I figure you may as well just make him into a ranged tank. He should be able to perform really well as a ranged tank simply because he's inflicting a lot of debuffs on the foe. And then with distant defense and attack res solo, he should be able to tank a lot more because of the dragon wall he gets from his weapon. Quick Riposte is also there so he can double more naturally. And then his premium set is basically just an upgraded set from his budget build. He's running distant defense 4 with joint drive attack and mystic boost. So that way he can not only have some sort of sustainability, but also tank a lot more in general. That being said, I find that while Julius is really, really good, there are too many units and effects in the game that basically destroy any sort of damage reduction that he may have. We're talking about units such as Young Innis, Duocrom, and skills such as Lethality and Deadeye, which will pierce through him like knife to a butter. It's a similar issue I had with Yenfei back when I did my sword video, but it's basically the same thing for Julius. It's not really any different, but he's still a really, really solid red tome unit. Next we have Null, who's basically another regular generic demote. He comes with Fox Tome. He has 37 attack, which is really good. He has workable speed at 32 and pretty decent res at 35. If you just want to use him on budget, you may as well speed stack him and give him Fury Desperation. You can keep his innate speed pulling because his res is pretty high, and it could help for more natural doubles. While his premium build is definitely taking advantage of the enemy phase a lot more, you're still speed stacking him with the boon and refining Unity Blooms for speed. But with Mirror Stance, Sabotage Attack, and Joint Drive Attack, he should be able to tank a lot more. Still, he's basically just another generic red tome who can basically do what all the other generic red tomes can do, provided that you have access to the resources. Which is why I'm not going to give him anything above Urk, and I think 5.5 is more than suitable. Next we have Lilina, who has a Chill Res Deathblow tome. She has 37 attack, which is really good. She has 31 res, which is also pretty good, but her speed and defense and HP aren't exactly the best. But you're basically just going to be using her for one-shot potential anyway. If you want to use her on budget, you may as well give her double death blow with Swordbreaker and double attack wave, so that way she can have a lot more attack to work with. You could also swap it out for a rouse and then give her death blow seal, which is perfectly reasonable too. And then for a premium build, you're basically doing the same thing. You're giving her triple death blow with low attack res and joint drive attack. Basically, you're stacking up her attack as much as possible so she can potentially one-shot. Overall, though, Lilina does hit really hard, I do find that with the amount of damage reduction stuff in the game, as well as with the basically outdated PRF, I find that she's not really exactly going to be better than Hilda, but I find that Hilda has a higher ceiling of damage output, which is why I'm going to rank Lilina 0.5 or less. Next we have Lawrence, who basically had the first Rabbit Tome, but it was labeled something else. I can't remember what though. His stat line is not really that good. He has 45 HP, which is high, but he has 32, 31 attack speed, which is whatever offensively, and 25, 29 defense res, which is whatever defensively. If you want to use him on budget, I highly recommend something. I don't really know what you're supposed to do with Lawrence on budget. You may as well just make him into a support unit. You can stack up his HP and res so you can run Sabotage and Panic, and that's pretty much it. I don't really know what else you're supposed to do with Lawrence on budget because his performance isn't really that good on budget. Of course, on Premium, he still isn't exactly the best offensively, but you can use him with Swift Sparrow 3, No Follow-Up, and Flashing Blade, and Iceberg, so that way his damage output is a lot better. Overall though, while Lawrence is generic, I find that his overall performance comparatively to the other generic units is not that good, which is why I'm going to give him 0.5 or less. His stat line is just a big mess. It doesn't really help that even with merges, it's not exactly going to be the best either. So I am willing to say that a 5 out of 10 seems relatively fair. Next we have Leon, who has a Raven Tome effect that inflicts -4 attack and res and comes with quick riposte, which isn't actually bad at all for his enemy phase niche. He has 34 attack, which is pretty good. He has 26, 30 defense and res, which is bolstered by his Refine to effectively give him 30, 34 defense res, which is pretty good at no merges. If you want to use him on budget, you may as well just stack up his attack and res by giving him stuff like Oath and Forms, and then chill res so his damage output is a lot better. And then on Premium, you could give him double distant defense with no counter disrupt so he can counter any sort of sweep effect, and then give him Joint Drive attack so his damage output is a lot better. Honestly, as tame as the Refine was, I do find that overall his weapon was not bad by any means, and his performance isn't too bad overall. And the fact that he has quick riposte built into his weapon means he doesn't have to sacrifice any sort of slot for it so he can double naturally. Next we have Miranda, who's another generic red tome. She has 36, 35 attack speed, which is really good offensively. She has 36 res, which is also pretty good for tanking. Her defense is definitely on the lower side, and her HP could always be better, but she does come with Serpent Tome, so you can actually make her into an enemy phase tank. Her speed isn't bad by any means, so you can stack it up with speed res solo and attack res solo. You could give her sabotage attack, so she's tanking even more, and speed smoke, so she's doubling more often. And then on Premium, you could give her Unity Blooms with no follow-up, attack res ideal, and speed res menace. So that way she's just tanking and dealing a lot of damage in general. Her res stat is really, really good, her speed stat is really good, and her attack stat is also really good, especially when maxed out. So to give her something like attack res ideal with speed res menace will allow her to not only output a significant amount of damage more often, but tank more often too. And with Unity Blooms inflicting debuffs and healing, she should not struggle to not only output damage, but to take damage as well. Even so, I would definitely say she's one of the better generics that we have in the game, but she is still generic. So I do think a 5.5 out of 10 is still fine. Next we have Morgan, who comes with a Menace plug-in tome, which isn't bad by any means. He has 33, 34 attack, which is pretty good offensively. His mixed bulk is not really that good, especially with the lower HP set that he comes with. But he does make up for it a bit, because his tome does inflict -4 attack, speed, defense, res at base, so it is a lot better than it would be without it. On top of the Menace that inflicts -5 attack speed res and grants attack speed res +5 to the unit. If you want to use him on budget, you may as well give him Ideal with attack and speed smoke in dual range. The reason we're giving him double smoke is just so he can take on multiple combats, because Menace only hits one unit unless the spacing is rather convenient. And then on Premium, you may as well just make him into a Omni tank with close foil, no follow-up, joint drive attack, and speed res solo. And you will want healing, because not only does his weapon rely on being above 25% HP, but it is convenient for long-term longevity. That being said, while I do think he is a really solid plug-in tome user, especially since it inflicts speed debuffs on the foe, I do find that a generic with high speed and decent attack with Vulture Tome is going to be able to replicate his niche relatively easily. And even though he may be one of the better plug-in tome users in the game, I do find that his niche is no longer a quote-unquote niche, simply because, again, the Vulture Tome exists, which is why I'm only going to give him a 6.5 out of 10. Next we have Peleus, who's probably one of the best generic tomes that we have in the game offensively, with 40, 36 attack and speed, which is really, really high. He comes with a Lion Tome that grants attack risk +5 to unit during combat if the foe's HP is above 75% or more, and another effect that doesn't really matter all too much, unless you want to use it supportively. If you want to use him on budget, you may as well keep his innate Brazen attack speed and Oath and give him Desperation with another Brazen, so that way he can output a significant amount of damage. He could set up on a mage or something, and then he'll have his Brazens ready to go. And then if you want to use him on premium, you could always give him a Blade Tome, while not necessarily the most optimal thing to do. It does leverage on his really, really high attack stat, so he can output a significant amount of damage, especially with Ideal and Menace present. Peleus, I'm willing to give a 6 out of 10, simply because out of all the generic tomes that we have in the game, he's one of the best ones that we have. I find that the difference between someone like Ark and Peleus is a bit more noticeable comparatively to other generics. So that's why I'm going to give him a 6 out of 10. Next we have Ray, who is probably one of the most notorious red tomes that we have in the game, simply because a lot of people don't like him, and his refund wasn't exactly the best. His base effect's actually not too bad. It has cavalry effectiveness with dull ranged on it, which isn't too bad. His offensive stat line and stat line overall isn't exactly the best. He has low HP with middling res and low defense. His offensive stat line of 32-29 attack speed isn't exactly the best either, so he will need a lot of investment. If you want to use him on budget, you may as well just stack up his attack and res as much as possible. And while it may be difficult to do, he doesn't really have much of a choice, simply because there isn't really a lot of other niches he has going for him, especially with the owl effect that relies on him being adjacent to allies. And then for his premium set, you could just make him into a bigger range tank in general with double distant defense, with Null C Disrupt and Joint Distant Guard. Basically make him a lot more tanky in general, which isn't the worst by any means. But Ray as a unit isn't exactly the best anyway, so I'm only willing to give him a 5 out of 10. He's still rather comparable to Lawrence at generic, but his weapon isn't exactly the best in general, so I don't think it's really worth giving him any additional points over Lawrence. Next we have Salem, who comes with the Vulture Tome that we kept bringing up. His offensive stat line is really good at 38, 36 attack and speed, and his res stat is really high at 38. However, his defense stat is really low at 18. If you want to use him on budget, you may as well just give him Ideal with Res Smoke and Sabotage Attack. He does come with Sabotage Attack, so it is self-sufficient, and the Res Smoke does allow him to keep Vulture Tome active at a lot of times, and Speed Res Solo for the synergy. However, if you want to use him on premium, you might as well just go double solo with Menace and no follow-up. You could also run a unit that has triple sabotage, such as Tamari Air or Tamari Tethys, and you should be good to go. And similar to Peleus, I do find that their stat lines are definitely the best when it comes to generic red tomes, which is why I'm also going to give him a 6 out of 10. Next we have Solon, who has he has a tome, I guess, which is fine. It's fine, I guess. He has 45 HP with 38 attack and 38 res, which happen to be his best stats. However, his dump stats are easily going to be his speed and defense at 20 and 24 respectively. If you want to use him on budget, you may as well just make him into a support unit with Sabotage Res and Panic Void, and also stack up HP and Res respectively. His HP is pretty high, so you don't really have to worry about missing panic checks, especially on premium, where you can run Sudden Panic instead with Infantry Pulse and Ardul Infantry. Kind of similar to Iago, except rather than running Sudden Panic, he was running Sabotage, but that's aside the point. He does have the option though. Overall though, I do find that Solon isn't exactly a really good unit in general. He does have that supportive niche, but his tome is really, really situational, and his damage output in general isn't exactly the best, especially when he has no speed, no defense, and he can easily be taken down by any sort of physical unit, or any ranged unit that targets his defense. Next we have Sophia, who comes with a Raven Tome that grants defense risk +4 if the foe initiates combat. She's basically a more min-max Leon, and with her Resplendence, she does get even more stats. They're basically going to be doing the same thing, except rather than having Quick Robust built into her weapon, she has to have it somewhere in her kit. So for her budget build, she will have it in her B slot. You'll run double distant defense with attack smoke and have her tank a lot more. But on premium, you could give her something that's a lot more mixed phase. You could give her close foil with low attack and defense res menace. So that way she could just be a better overall tank. That being said, I do find that having Quick Riposte built into Leon's weapon is going to give him a bit of an edge over Sophia, even though she has more stats, which is why I'm going to give her a 5.5 out of 10 rather than a 6. She's still pretty decent as a tanky red tome unit, but comparatively to Leon, I do find that he is going to be a bit better. Next we have Tharja, who has a blade tome that comes with attack speed Ryan. Her offensive stat line isn't too bad by any means. It has 32, 34 attack and speed, but her mixed bulk is really low, especially with 39 HP. If you want to use her on budget, you may as well just give her double wave with darting blow and desperation, so that way she can double more often, and she can output a significant amount of damage because, again, she has a blade tome. But if you want to use her on the more premium side, you can give her close foil Vantage with attack res menace, because she's not really going to be taking too many hits in general, so you may as well make her into a Vantage unit and hope to God she can one-shot. Overall, I don't think she's too bad nowadays, especially since Panic is no longer nearly as prevalent as it once was back in the day with, with Aversa and stuff and all the other stuff like Sun and Panic and whatnot. It's still there, but it's not nearly as common as it once was, which is why I'm willing to give her a 6 out of 10. Next we have Valentine's Titania, who is basically another Arete, except rather than having a bit more attack and a bit more res, she has a bit more speed to work with. She has Loyal Wreath that is basically an owl tome that grants Spectrum 3 if she's adjacent to an ally. If you want to use her on budget, you may as well just give her a Raven tome with Triangle Adept and Bowbreaker, and just make her into another Cavalry Henry in a sense. I also give her attack defense solo and rouse attack defense so she can patch up her lower defense and take a hit when needed to, especially against colorless bows and colorless daggers. However, it's not guaranteed to always work because 17 defense with 35 HP isn't exactly that great. Of course, on premium, you can give her the Fox Tome with solo and rouse attack speed 4 with Trace and Blade Session. Basically, you're leveraging on her offensive stat line a lot more. And because she is a Cav, she should be able to take advantage of Trace pretty well. But offensively, she's still not really the greatest. And she's basically just another Arete that just came earlier, which is why I'm only willing to give her a 4.5 out of 10. And then finally, we have Veld, who is probably the gimmick to all gimmick red tomes. His stat line does not matter at all, because this tome just works by itself on the first 5 turns. It inflicts -7 attack and speed on a foe on the enemy team with the lowest specified stat depending on the turn. Turn 1 is HP, turn 2 is attack, turn 3 is speed, turn 4 is defense, and turn 5 is res. Which means on budget, you don't really have to do anything, because this tome does everything for you. Of course, if you want to do something, you could give him double HP res 2 with Sabotage res, and inflict even more debuffs on the foe. And then on premium, again, you still don't really have to do anything, but you can give him Sun and Panic with Infantry Pulse and R-Dual Infantry, and basically make him into an infantry support unit. But overall, I would say that Veld is definitely one of the weirdest units I can rank. Performance-wise, he's definitely a lot more gimmicky. He does work really well in Summoner Duels. Aether Raids is definitely a different story. It's definitely not as consistent, but the first turn will always hit a Mythic, which isn't bad by any means, simply because you can stop them in their traps and they could always hit a Dancer. And the cost rating is going to be 10 out of 10 because he doesn't need anything. He has Petrify. That's all he needs. And that's about it for the Red Tome video. I had a good amount of fun ranking these red tome units. I found it was a bit more difficult simply because there aren't that many inheritable red tomes in the game, and a lot of the generics basically have similar stat lines. So it was a bit more difficult for me to rank them overall, but I still had a blast doing it. If you have any agreements or disagreements with this list, let me know down below because I am definitely curious on your thoughts. If you want to see more of these, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.